June 20, 1743, a single British warship faces a Spanish treasure galleon in the Philippine Sea. Admiral George Anson commands HMS Centurion, alone and 8,000 miles from home, after 4 years of desperate survival. The Spanish ship carries a fortune beyond imagination, over $400,000 in silver and gold, equivalent to billions today. Anson has already achieved what others thought impossible: circumnavigated the globe whilst raiding enemy colonies, survived storms that destroyed his fleet, and kept his remaining ship battle-ready through sheer determination. This will be his 4th major victory. He'll win the battle in 3 hours, capture the treasure, and sail home triumphant. Across his entire career, Anson fought 7 major engagements and won every single one without losing a single ship under his command. 40 years before Nelson became legend, George Anson proved that British naval power could project force globally, win consistently, and do it without the catastrophic losses his contemporaries accepted as inevitable. Yet ask anyone to name great British admirals, and Anson's name rarely appears. This is the story of the forgotten admiral who never lost, and why history let his extraordinary achievements slip into obscurity. If you want to discover how excellence can be forgotten, hit that like button and subscribe. George Anson was born on April 23, 1697, at Shugborough Hall in Staffordshire, into a family of comfortable means, but not great wealth. His father was a country squire, respectable, but hardly part of the aristocratic elite who typically commanded the Royal Navy's finest ships. At 14 years old in 1712, young George entered naval service as most officers did, through family connections and the patronage system that dominated Georgian England. The Royal Navy of the early 18th century was less a meritocracy than a web of political favours, purchased commissions, and inherited positions. What distinguished Anson from the beginning was his approach to the profession. Whilst other young officers treated naval service as a gentleman's pursuit, requiring minimal effort between bouts of shore leave, Anson studied seamanship, navigation, and gunnery with methodical intensity. His early career took him to the West Indies and Mediterranean, the proving grounds where officers learned their trade through yellow fever, pirate encounters, and the occasional skirmish with enemy vessels. He survived these postings not through luck, but through careful attention to ship maintenance, crew health, and tactical preparation that his contemporaries often neglected. By 1724, Anson had achieved post-captain rank, the critical threshold that guaranteed he'd eventually become an admiral through seniority if he simply survived long enough. His reputation grew steadily through the 1720s and 1730s as a commander whose ships were always in fighting trim, whose crews suffered fewer casualties from disease, and who could be trusted with difficult assignments. This wasn't romantic or particularly exciting. Anson was methodical where others were reckless, calculating where others relied on courage alone, and disciplined in ways that made him seem cold to subordinates who expected their captains to match the hard-drinking, hard-fighting stereotype. The Royal Navy of this era was notoriously corrupt. Dockyards pilfered supplies, contractors delivered substandard materials, captains embezzled crew wages, and admirals treated their positions as political sinecures rather than military commands. Ships rotted at anchor because nobody maintained them properly. Crews died of scurvy because captains couldn't be bothered with proper provisioning. Battles were lost because officers lacked basic tactical competence. Against this backdrop of institutional decay, Anson's insistence on proper procedure and competent seamanship made him unusual enough to attract Admiralty attention. By 1740, Anson was 43 years old, a senior captain with an excellent service record, but no particular fame or fortune. He'd never commanded in a major fleet action. He'd never captured a significant prize. His career had been solid, professional, and thoroughly unremarkable by the standards of officers who achieved lasting fame. He was exactly the sort of reliable, competent commander the Admiralty could trust with a difficult mission that required endurance and professionalism rather than glory-seeking heroics. Then, the War of Austrian Succession erupted. Britain found itself at odds with Spain over colonial trade and territorial disputes, and somebody in the Admiralty decided that disrupting Spanish commerce in the Pacific might be strategically useful. They needed a commander who wouldn't collapse under pressure, who could maintain discipline during extended deployment, and who might actually survive the mission rather than getting his ships sunk through incompetence. They chose George Anson. It would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in British naval history, though nobody knew it at the time. In September 1740, the Admiralty handed George Anson a mission that was equal parts strategic brilliance and logistical nightmare. Britain and Spain were sliding toward open warfare over colonial trade rights and territorial claims in the Americas. Someone in London had decided that a squadron sailing into the Pacific, Spain's private lake, where their treasure fleets operated virtually unopposed, could wreak havoc on Spanish commerce whilst diverting their naval resources from European waters. The War of Austrian Succession would officially begin in 1740, dragging most of Europe into a sprawling conflict over who would inherit Habsburg territories. But for Britain, the Spanish colonial empire represented both threat and opportunity. Anson's squadron comprised 6 warships and 2 supply vessels: HMS Centurion, his flagship mounting 60 guns, HMS Gloucester and HMS Severn, both 50-gun ships, HMS Pearl and HMS Wager, smaller vessels, and HMS Trial, a tiny sloop. Supporting them were 2 victualling ships, Anna and Industry. On paper, 1,180 men would sail. The objective was straightforward: sail around Cape Horn into the Pacific, raid Spanish ports and shipping along the South American coast, capture the annual treasure galleon sailing from Acapulco to Manila, and either return home or continue westward around the world. The problems became apparent before they even left Portsmouth. The Admiralty had assembled this squadron from whatever ships they could spare, which meant old vessels in questionable condition. Centurion was sound enough, but several others desperately needed refitting. Worse, the manning was catastrophic. The government had promised trained seamen, but instead delivered Chelsea pensioners, invalids from the Royal Hospital Chelsea, men missing limbs or so ravaged by age and illness they could barely stand. Of the 500 soldiers allocated to provide landing parties, 210 were these pensioners, some over 70 years old, many dying before the squadron even departed. The departure date kept slipping. Anson had wanted to sail in April to round Cape Horn during the southern summer. Political delays, supply problems, and bureaucratic incompetence pushed departure to September 18, 1740, heading directly into the southern winter, the worst possible time to attempt the passage. Spanish intelligence had learned of the expedition and dispatched their own squadron to intercept Anson before he reached the Pacific. The mission was compromised before it began. Anson's orders were explicit, but the resources provided were criminally inadequate. His charts of the Pacific were decades old and dangerously inaccurate. His crews included hundreds of men physically incapable of hauling lines or climbing rigging. His ships needed maintenance they wouldn't receive. Every professional mariner in Portsmouth knew this expedition was doomed, that the Admiralty had essentially sent Anson to die whilst making a gesture toward disrupting Spanish operations. The strategic thinking was sound. Hitting Spanish colonial trade could force them to divert warships from European waters, and capturing treasure would fund British war efforts whilst denying Spain the silver they needed to maintain their empire. But the execution showed all the hallmarks of 18th century British military planning. Ambitious objectives paired with criminally inadequate preparation, political interference overriding professional judgment, and a casual assumption that British courage would somehow compensate for material deficiencies. Anson understood exactly what he'd been handed. A suicide mission disguised as a strategic masterstroke. He could have refused, citing the obvious inadequacy of ships and crews. Instead, on September 18, 1740, his squadron weighed anchor and sailed for Cape Horn, heading directly into the worst maritime disaster in British naval history to that point. And somehow, impossibly, Anson would transform catastrophe into triumph. The squadron reached Madeira in October 1740, already showing signs of the disaster to come. Several Chelsea pensioners had died during the short Atlantic crossing, their bodies committed to the sea with grim efficiency. By the time they rounded Brazil and began the approach to Cape Horn in March 1741, scurvy had appeared among crews who'd been at sea for 5 months on salt provisions and stale water. The disease began subtly: fatigue, aching joints, spots on the skin. Then gums started bleeding, old wounds reopened spontaneously, and men too weak to stand watch lay helpless in their hammocks whilst their teeth loosened and fell out. Cape Horn in autumn is among the most hostile environments on Earth. The squadron encountered storms that survivors would describe decades later with visible trauma. Waves the height of 3-story buildings crashed over the ship's decks, tearing away boats, guns, anything not lashed down with triple security. The wind shrieked through rigging with such force that sailors couldn't hear shouted orders 3 feet away. Temperatures plummeted below freezing whilst men worked soaked through, their hands so numb they couldn't feel the lines they hauled. Ships disappeared into walls of spray and darkness, losing contact with the squadron, each vessel fighting alone for survival. The passage that should have taken 2 weeks stretched into 58 days of continuous hell. HMS Wega struck rocks off the Chilean coast and wrecked, her crew marooned and descending into mutiny and cannibalism. HMS Seven and HMS Pearl, battered beyond endurance, turned back for England along with the supply ships, their captains deciding survival trumped orders. HMS Gloucester made it through but so damaged and disease-ravaged she'd be abandoned months later. Only HMS Centurion, Anson's flagship, maintained fighting capability, and even that was generous description of her condition. When Centurion finally limped into Juan Fernandez Island in June 1741, her crew had been reduced from 500 to barely 200 men capable of standing watch, and half of those were compromised by scurvy. The island, the same one where Alexander Selkirk had been marooned decades earlier, inspiring Robinson Crusoe, became their salvation. Fresh water, wild goats, vegetables growing in the temperate climate, all the things that reversed scurvy's progression. Anson established a camp, buried the dead who'd succumbed during the final approach, and began the slow process of recovery. His situation was beyond desperate. He'd lost most of his squadron. His remaining ship needed extensive repairs with no dockyard facilities. His crew was decimated. Spanish warships were presumably hunting for him. He was 8,000 miles from friendly territory with no support, no supplies beyond what they could improvise, and orders to raid the richest colonial empire in the world. Most commanders would have declared the mission impossible and sailed for home, reporting honorable failure against overwhelming odds. The Admiralty would have accepted this. After all, they'd set him up for failure with their inadequate preparation. A court-martial might have been convened for form's sake, but Anson would have been quietly exonerated and given another command, his reputation intact as a professional who'd done his best with terrible resources. Instead, after 2 months recovering at Juan Fernandez, Anson called his surviving officers together and announced they would proceed with the original mission. They would raid Spanish shipping and settlements with a single ship. They would capture prizes and gather intelligence. They would hunt the treasure galleon. His officers thought he'd gone mad. He was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. By September 1741, HMS Centurion was as ready as makeshift repairs could manage. Her crew recovered from scurvy and surprisingly willing to follow Anson into what still seemed like certain death. His first target was deliberate psychological warfare. The town of Paita, on the Peruvian coast, a Spanish colonial settlement that had never been seriously threatened by enemy forces. The Spanish Empire's Pacific territories had enjoyed a century of security, protected by distance, and the assumption that no hostile power could maintain forces so far from home. Anson intended to shatter that assumption. On November 13, 1741, Centurion appeared off Paita without warning. Anson sent landing parties ashore, who encountered virtually no resistance. The town's defenders fled at the sight of British Marines. His men systematically looted warehouses and merchant houses, gathering everything of value whilst Anson maintained strict discipline against unnecessary violence towards civilians. This wasn't mindless destruction, but calculated economic warfare. He burned selected buildings, seized ships in the harbor, and departed with considerable plunder, leaving the Spanish colonial authorities stunned that a lone British warship was operating freely in waters they'd considered absolutely secure. The Paita raid announced Anson's presence and strategy. He would avoid Spanish warships, which could overwhelm his single vessel, but hit soft targets where Spanish colonial defenses were non-existent. More importantly, he gathered intelligence from captured Spanish sailors and merchants. They talked freely, assuming either they'd be killed or that one British ship couldn't possibly threaten the broader system. They were wrong on both counts. Anson treated prisoners well, which encouraged cooperation, and the intelligence they provided was invaluable. Through late 1741 and early 1742, Centurion ranged along the coast, capturing merchant vessels laden with cloth, wine, and silver. Each prize was stripped of valuables, and the crews released with their ships or in neutral ports. The prize money was accumulating, thousands of pounds that would eventually be distributed among Centurion's crew, transforming common sailors into wealthy men by their standards. More significantly, Spanish commerce was being disrupted. Ship owners grew reluctant to sail. Insurance rates soared. The colonial economy, dependent on regular maritime trade, began suffering. But Centurion was deteriorating. Months of hard sailing in tropical waters, the storm damage from Cape Horn never properly repaired, and the constant strain of operations meant she desperately needed a proper dockyard. The nearest friendly port was literally on the other side of the world. Anson made another bold decision. He would sail west across the Pacific to Macau, the Portuguese trading settlement on the Chinese coast. It was a staggering gamble, crossing the world's largest ocean with a damaged ship and limited supplies. But staying in Spanish waters meant eventual discovery by superior forces. The Pacific crossing began in May 1742 and became another nightmare. Scurvy returned, despite Anson's best efforts to provision with fresh food. Storms damaged already weakened masts and rigging. They missed their landfalls due to inaccurate charts, wandering across empty oceans searching for islands that weren't where the maps claimed. In August, they reached Tinian in the Marianas, only to have Centurion nearly wrecked when anchors dragged during a typhoon. The crew, reduced to barely enough men to sail the ship, watched their lifeline drift toward rocks before winds mercifully shifted. By November 1742, when they finally reached Macau, Centurion was held together by hope and Anson's refusal to accept failure. They'd been gone 2 years. London assumed them dead. The Spanish certainly did. But Anson had one more prize in mind, and he'd positioned himself perfectly to take it. The Nuestra Señora de Covadonga was the linchpin of Spain's Pacific trade system, an annual treasure galleon sailing from Acapulco to Manila, carrying silver mined in Mexico to purchase Chinese silks, porcelain, and spices that would eventually reach Spain via Manila's connection to the colonial trade network. The ship typically carried between 1 and 2 million silver pesos, a fortune so vast that her sailing date was kept secret, her route carefully planned, and Spanish authorities assumed the sheer distance and timing made interception virtually impossible. Anson had spent months in Macau gathering intelligence, bribing Portuguese officials for information, and interrogating Spanish merchants about the galleon's schedule. By June 1743, he'd determined that Covadonga would sail from Acapulco in March, reaching Philippine waters by mid-June. He positioned Centurion off Cape Espiritu Santo, the traditional landfall for ships approaching Manila from the east, and waited. It was a gamble based on incomplete information across thousands of miles of ocean, but Anson had proved throughout this voyage that calculated risks backed by thorough preparation produced results. On June 20, 1743, lookouts spotted sail on the horizon. The Spanish galleon was exactly where Anson had predicted, sailing confidently toward Manila with no expectation of meeting hostile forces. Covadonga mounted 36 guns and carried 550 men, a formidable opponent, but Anson had spent the previous months in Macau drilling his crew relentlessly. British naval gunnery doctrine emphasized rapid, accurate fire over the weight of broadside, and Centurion's crew could fire 3 rounds for every 2 Spanish volleys. The chase lasted several hours as Centurion overhauled the heavier, slower galleon. Spanish captain Geronimo de Montero initially attempted to run, then realized escape was impossible and cleared for action. His crew was a mix of sailors, soldiers, and passengers, nothing like the trained fighting crew Anson commanded. At approximately 1400 hours, Centurion ranged alongside at less than pistol shot, so close the gunners could see Spanish faces through the smoke, and opened fire with devastating effect. The engagement became a masterclass in naval gunnery. Centurion's guns, served by crews who'd practiced until loading and firing became mechanical reflex, poured round shot and chain into Covadonga's hull and rigging. Spanish return fire was brave but ragged, their guns manned by soldiers and sailors without the drilling that created effective gunnery. Within an hour, Covadonga's masts were damaged, her hull holed in multiple places, and her decks running with blood from men struck by splinters and shot. Spanish casualties mounted horrifically. 67 killed, 84 wounded from the initial broadsides and the sustained pounding that followed. British losses were almost absurdly light. 2 dead, 17 wounded, testament to superior gunnery that suppressed Spanish fire before it could achieve accuracy. By 1700 hours, after 3 hours of continuous action, Montero struck his colours. The treasure galleon was Anson's. When boarding parties searched below decks, they discovered what Anson had gambled everything to capture. 13,143 pieces of 8 Spanish silver coins, packed in chests, along with gold and valuable trade goods. At contemporary exchange rates, this represented $400,000 sterling, equivalent to perhaps $500 million today. More than mere money, it was validation of everything Anson had endured: the storms, the scurvy, the years of desperate survival, justified by success beyond even his ambitious planning. His crew, many of whom had signed on as common sailors expecting wages of $1 monthly, would each receive shares worth years of normal income. Anson himself, entitled to the commander's portion, had just become one of the wealthiest men in Britain. Now, he just had to get it all home alive. Getting a captured treasure galleon and a battered British warship from Philippine waters back to England presented challenges almost equal to everything that had come before. Anson couldn't simply sail for home. The direct route through the Indian Ocean meant passing Dutch and potentially French territories, where news of his treasure would make him an irresistible target for interception. He needed repairs, supplies, and diplomatic cover for what was effectively the largest prize captured by a British warship in decades. Canton provided the solution, though dealing with Chinese authorities tested Anson's diplomatic skills as thoroughly as combat had tested his tactical abilities. The Chinese government maintained strict control over foreign trade, confining European merchants to a small zone and requiring elaborate protocols for any official business. Anson, commanding a foreign warship with a captured Spanish prize ship loaded with silver, represented the sort of irregular situation Chinese officials found deeply troubling. Months of negotiation followed, with bribes distributed through the Portuguese middlemen who dominated European contact with China, before Anson secured permission to refit Centurion and transfer the treasure. The work took until December 1743. Centurion's hull was recorked, her rigging replaced, and supplies loaded for the long voyage home. The treasure was transferred to Centurion's hold, packed into her deepest storage, where the weight would help ballast and the security could be maintained. Covadonga, too damaged and requiring too many crew to sail home, was sold to Chinese merchants. On December 15, 1743, Centurion departed Canton with a skeleton crew of barely 200 men, all who remained from the nearly 2,000 who'd sailed from Portsmouth 3 years earlier. The Indian Ocean crossing proceeded without major incident, though Anson maintained constant vigilance for enemy warships. French and Spanish forces would have given anything to intercept him, and Dutch neutrality was questionable at best. He avoided major ports, touching only briefly for water and fresh provisions, keeping Centurion moving westward with steady determination. By March 1744, They'd rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Atlantic, the final stretch home. The Atlantic presented its own dangers. French privateers operated off European coasts, and Spanish warships from Cadiz routinely patrolled approaches to the English Channel. Anson sailed north carefully, avoiding likely patrol routes, until June 15, 1744, when Centurion anchored at Spithead to a reception nobody aboard could have anticipated. News had reached England weeks earlier through merchant vessels that had spoken to ships in Canton. Fragmentary reports that Anson's expedition, assumed lost, had not only survived but captured the Spanish treasure galleon. The Royal Navy, the government, and the public were electrified. When Centurion arrived, crowds lined the harbour. The treasure was offloaded under guard and transported to London in a procession that became a national celebration. 32 wagons carried the chests of silver through streets packed with spectators who turned out to see physical proof that British naval power could project force globally and win staggering victories. The prize money distribution followed legal procedures that took months, but when settled, every surviving crew member received shares that transformed their lives. Common sailors received $300–400, equivalent to a decade's wages. Officers became wealthy men. Anson's portion, including his captain's share and admiral's percentage, came to approximately $91,000, one of the largest personal fortunes in Britain, enough to purchase estates and live in aristocratic luxury. More significant than the money was the demonstration of strategic possibility. A single determined commander with inadequate resources had circumnavigated the globe, raided enemy commerce, and returned with treasure that funded a year of British war operations. The psychological impact on Britain's enemies was devastating. Nowhere was safe from British naval power. But Anson's career was just beginning, and his most important battles were still ahead. The voyage had made Anson a celebrity, but the Royal Navy needed more than heroes. It needed commanders who could win fleet actions against enemy warships, not just capture treasure ships and raid undefended ports. In 1746, as the War of Austrian Succession ground through its 6th year, Anson received promotion to Rear Admiral and command of the Western Squadron, Britain's primary force for intercepting French convoys attempting to supply their forces in North America. France was pouring resources into reinforcing Canada and their Caribbean colonies, shipping troops, supplies, and weapons across the Atlantic in heavily escorted convoys that represented vital strategic assets. On May 3, 1747, intelligence reached Anson that a major French convoy was approaching Cape Finisterre off the northwestern coast of Spain. The convoy comprised 30 merchantmen carrying supplies for French forces in North America and the West Indies, escorted by 6 warships under Admiral de la Jonquière. Anson commanded 14 ships of the line, giving him overwhelming superiority. But fleet actions were notoriously difficult to execute effectively. The accepted tactical doctrine involved forming a formal line of battle, with ships engaging opposite numbers in a rigid formation that minimized risk of collision, but also reduced flexibility. Anson ignored conventional wisdom. When his lookouts spotted the French convoy at dawn, he immediately signaled general chase, ordering each British ship to pursue the enemy at maximum speed regardless of formation. This was revolutionary and controversial. Line admirals argued that breaking formation invited disaster, that ships acting independently could be isolated and overwhelmed. Anson calculated differently. His numerical superiority meant that even scattered, his ships would outnumber French escorts in any engagement. More importantly, the speed of pursuit mattered more than the elegance of formation. If the French reached neutral Spanish ports, they'd be safe. Every hour of careful tactical positioning was an hour the enemy used to escape. The chase lasted through the morning. British ships, taking advantage of favorable winds, steadily overhauled the fleeing French convoy. By early afternoon, the fastest British vessels had closed with the French rear guard. What followed was a running engagement spread across miles of ocean, with individual British ships engaging French escorts as they caught them. HMS Centurion, the same ship that had carried Anson around the world, now under another captain but still in the squadron, engaged the French Invincible and captured her after 90 minutes of pounding broadsides. By evening, all 6 French warships had surrendered. The merchant convoy scattered, many falling to British pursuit over the following days. French losses included approximately 1,200 casualties killed and wounded, and thousands more captured along with their valuable cargoes. British casualties were remarkably light, fewer than 300 killed and wounded across the entire engagement, and critically, not a single British ship was lost or disabled. Every vessel that had entered action sailed away under its own power, ready to fight again within days. The strategic impact was devastating for France. North American reinforcements and supplies that were desperately needed never arrived. The captured French warships were added to the Royal Navy. Invincible would become HMS Invincible, serving for years in British colours. The aggressive pursuit doctrine Anson had demonstrated was vindicated by results, though conservative admirals continued grumbling about proper procedure. Anson barely paused. French convoys would continue attempting the Atlantic crossing, and he'd be waiting for them. 6 months later, he'd proved that the first Battle of Cape Finisterre wasn't luck, but the first demonstration of a tactical system that would dominate naval warfare for the next century. October 14, 1747, brought the opportunity to validate everything Anson had demonstrated in May. French authorities, desperate to resupply their colonies despite the earlier convoy's destruction, assembled an even more ambitious effort. 252 merchantmen carrying troops, supplies, and weapons for North America and the West Indies, escorted by 8 warships under Admiral de l'Étendard. This represented a massive investment of French resources, and its safe arrival would significantly strengthen their strategic position in the colonial conflict that had become central to the War of Austrian Succession. Anson, by now promoted to Vice Admiral and commanding the same Western Squadron, received intelligence of the convoy's departure and positioned his 14 ships of the line off Cape Finisterre to intercept. When lookouts spotted the massive French formation on October 14th, the situation appeared identical to May's engagement. Outnumbered enemy escorts protecting a valuable convoy, British numerical superiority, and the question of how to employ that advantage effectively. Anson again ordered General Chase, but this time refined his approach based on lessons from the first battle. He divided his squadron into 3 divisions, each under a capable commander with discretion to pursue independently, but coordinated to prevent the French from concentrating their escorts against isolated British ships. Anson personally led the van division in HMS Prince George, demonstrating the aggressive leadership he expected from subordinates. The signal was simple: pursue the enemy at maximum speed, engage as overtaken, accept no excuses for allowing French ships to escape. The chase began at noon and continued into evening, with British ships gradually overtaking the slower French merchantmen and their escorts. Unlike the May battle, which had concluded in daylight, this engagement stretched into darkness, testing crews' ability to fight at night when identifying friend from enemy became nearly impossible, and the risk of collision with your own ships was substantial. Traditional naval doctrine called for disengaging at nightfall to avoid exactly these risks. Anson kept pursuing, trusting his captain's competence and his crew's training to manage the additional danger. The fighting became a series of individual ship actions scattered across miles of darkening ocean. British ships closed with French escorts, pounding them with broadsides at point-blank range until French captains struck their colours. The darkness actually favoured Anson's approach. French ships attempting to escape couldn't coordinate their defence, whilst British ships could pursue individual targets without worrying about mutual support from enemy vessels. By dawn on October 15th, 6 of the 8 French warships had been captured, their crews overwhelmed by superior British gunnery and the persistent aggression that gave them no opportunity to disengage and regroup. The merchant convoy scattered across the Atlantic, many ships captured over subsequent days by British cruisers. Anson had positioned for exactly that purpose. French casualties again numbered over 1,000 killed and wounded, whilst British losses were fewer than 300. More importantly, Critical supplies for French North American forces were captured or destroyed, crippling their ability to maintain operations against British colonial forces and their Native American allies. For the second time in 6 months, Anson had intercepted a major French convoy, destroyed its escorts, and scattered the merchantmen without losing a single British ship. The pattern was undeniable: aggressive pursuit, superior gunnery, relentless pressure until enemy resistance collapsed. French naval morale was shattered. Crews who'd witnessed the destruction of 2 major convoys began refusing to sail, knowing that British squadrons hunted them with a competence and persistence they couldn't match. Back in London, the Admiralty recognized they had something unprecedented: a commander who won consistently, whose methods could be systematized, and whose success wasn't dependent on lucky circumstances, but on doctrine that could be taught. They were about to give him the power to reshape the entire Royal Navy. In June 1751, George Anson was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, the senior civilian position controlling the Royal Navy. At 54 years old, he'd achieved the summit of naval administration, with authority to direct everything from ship construction to officer appointments to strategic deployment. For most officers, this would have meant comfortable retirement from active service into bureaucratic sinecure, attending meetings and signing papers whilst younger men fought the wars. Anson approached the position with the same methodical intensity he'd brought to circumnavigating the globe and defeating French convoys. The Royal Navy he inherited was a shambling mess beneath its veneer of global power. Dockyards were riddled with corruption. Contractors delivered rotten timber and called it sound. Workers stole materials and sold them on black markets. Officials accepted bribes to approve substandard work. Ship designs varied wildly, with each vessel essentially custom-built rather than standardized, making repairs and refitting nightmarishly complicated when ships operating far from Britain needed parts. Officer procurement remained largely corrupt, with wealthy families purchasing commissions for incompetent sons, whilst talented sailors from lower classes were denied promotion. Crew conditions were atrocious even by harsh 18th century standards, with brutal discipline, inadequate food, and wages that arrived months or years late, if at all. Anson began systematic reform, using his reputation as leverage against resistance from entrenched interests who profited from the existing chaos. He standardized ship designs, establishing classes where vessels would be built to identical specifications, making maintenance and supply logistics vastly more efficient. He attacked dockyard corruption by installing inspectors, enforcing contracts, and prosecuting the most egregious thieves. He couldn't eliminate the patronage system, that was too deeply embedded in Georgian society, but he insisted that officers demonstrate minimum competence before receiving commands, quietly blocking appointments of aristocratic incompetents who'd previously received ships as political favors. Crew conditions improved incrementally under reforms Anson pushed through over fierce opposition from captains who viewed harsh discipline as necessary for maintaining order. Pay was regularized, provisions improved in quality and quantity, and medical care enhanced with an emphasis on preventing scurvy through the dietary measures Anson had learned during his circumnavigation. These weren't humanitarian gestures, but calculated improvements to combat effectiveness. Healthy, well-fed crews fought better and suffered lower mortality, meaning ships stayed operational longer. The shipbuilding program Anson oversaw would prove crucial when the 7 Years' War erupted in 1756. Britain entered that conflict with a fleet significantly larger and more effective than what existed when Anson took office, and throughout the war, which would establish Britain as the dominant global naval power, Anson's administrative work enabled the victories. His coordination of amphibious operations, supporting William Pitt's strategy of hitting French colonial possessions worldwide, demonstrated that his strategic vision extended beyond ship-to-ship combat to understanding how naval power projected British influence globally. He mentored younger officers who'd go on to distinguished careers, spreading the tactical doctrines he'd proven in combat: aggressive pursuit, superior gunnery, coordinated fleet actions that emphasized results over procedural correctness. The Royal Navy that would dominate the Napoleonic Wars was built on foundations Anson established during this decade of administrative work. His personal life remained stable throughout. His marriage to Elizabeth York in 1748 had been happy, though they had no children. His health gradually declined through the 1750s, but he remained active in Admiralty affairs, his opinions carrying weight that only increased as his reforms proved their worth through wartime success. When he died on June 6, 1762, at 65 years old, he'd lived to see the 7 Years' War concluded with Britain triumphant, possessing naval supremacy that would endure for more than a century. The navy he'd built would win an empire. The man who built it would be forgotten. The complete accounting of George Anson's combat record reveals an achievement without parallel in Royal Navy history. His major actions began with the Paita raid in November 1741, where he demonstrated that aggressive action against soft targets could produce strategic effects disproportionate to force employed. The capture of numerous Spanish prizes throughout 1741 and 1742, merchant vessels laden with silver, cloth, and trade goods, established him as a commerce raider whose presence disrupted entire colonial economies. The seizure of Nuestra Señora de Covadonga in June 1743 represented not just tactical brilliance, but strategic positioning, intelligence gathering, and gunnery superiority that allowed him to defeat a larger opponent with minimal casualties. The two battles of Cape Finisterre in 1747 elevated him from successful raider to fleet commander of genius. At the first engagement in May, he captured all 6 French escort warships whilst suffering negligible losses. At the second in October, he repeated the achievement against 8 French escorts, this time fighting into darkness and demonstrating that British crews under proper training and leadership could maintain effectiveness in conditions that typically forced disengagement. Across both battles, he captured or destroyed 14 enemy warships, scattered 2 massive convoys, and denied France critical supplies for their colonial forces. The statistical pattern is stark. Across these major actions and numerous smaller engagements, Anson captured or destroyed dozens of enemy vessels whilst never losing a single ship under his command. British casualties in his battles were consistently a fraction of enemy losses, testament to superior gunnery and tactics that minimized exposure whilst maximizing destructive effect. The prize money he captured exceeded $500,000 in total, a staggering sum that enriched the Royal Navy's coffers and his crews whilst impoverishing Britain's enemies. What made this record unprecedented wasn't just the victories, but the methodology behind them. Anson approached naval warfare as an engineering problem requiring systematic solutions. Superior ship maintenance meant his vessels could sustain operations longer and fight more effectively. Rigorous gunnery training meant his crews achieved accuracy and rate of fire that enemy vessels couldn't match. Aggressive tactics, particularly the general chase doctrine, meant he brought superior force to bear quickly rather than allowing enemies time to organize defense or escape. Risk management meant taking calculated chances based on thorough intelligence and preparation rather than reckless gambling on lucky outcomes. His contemporaries lost ships regularly. French, Spanish, and even British admirals accepted vessel losses as inevitable cost of naval warfare. Ships were captured, sunk, or wrecked through storms, enemy action, or navigational errors. Anson's zero-loss record across 7 major engagements spanning his entire active career wasn't luck, but the compound effect of hundreds of decisions prioritizing preparation over improvisation, training over courage alone, and systematic competence over individual heroism. When he died on June 6, 1762, his obituaries praised his circumnavigation and treasure capture, the romantic, easily understood achievements, whilst barely mentioning his fleet victories or administrative reforms. The Admiralty understood what it had lost. The officer who'd proven British naval power could project globally, win consistently, and do so with systematic methods that could be replicated by competent commanders following his doctrines. His funeral was respectful but not spectacular, his burial in the family plot at Colwich rather than Westminster Abbey. Within a generation, officers who'd served under him would rise to senior commands, spreading his methods throughout the service. His tactical innovations became orthodoxy, so thoroughly integrated into Royal Navy procedure that their origins were forgotten. The ships built to his standardized designs would carry British power across the world's oceans through the 18th and 19th centuries. Everything he'd fought to achieve had succeeded beyond imagination. The fame he might have reasonably expected never materialized. The erasure of George Anson from popular memory requires explanation because his achievements demanded lasting fame by any rational measure. The answer lies partly in timing and partly in the nature of historical narrative. 40 years after Anson's Cape Finisterre victories, Horatio Nelson would fight Trafalgar, achieving a decisive victory against combined French and Spanish fleets that effectively ended Napoleon's naval ambitions. More importantly for posterity, Nelson would die at the moment of triumph, creating the perfect martyrdom narrative that transforms competent commanders into immortal heroes. Britain got its victory and its romantic tragedy simultaneously, a story so compelling it overwhelmed everything that came before. Nelson's death created a cult of personality that Victorian Britain amplified into national mythology. Statues appeared in every major city, Trafalgar Square became London's symbolic centre, and Nelson's tactics were analysed in every naval academy worldwide. The Napoleonic Wars became the reference point for British naval supremacy, overshadowing earlier conflicts that lacked the existential drama of resisting Bonaparte's continental dominance. The War of Austrian Succession and 7 Years' War, where Anson had achieved his victories, seemed like preliminary skirmishes compared to the total war against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. Anson's survival worked against his legend. He didn't die heroically in battle, but lived to become an administrator, which lacks romantic appeal. His greatest achievements as First Lord of the Admiralty, reforming dockyards, standardizing ship construction, improving crew conditions, were crucial for British naval power, but deeply unsexy compared to boarding actions and broadsides. The circumnavigation was spectacular, but increasingly distant history by the 19th century, and the treasure capture seemed like piracy rather than legitimate warfare by Victorian standards that preferred to dress imperial conquest in moral rhetoric. The tactical innovations Anson pioneered became so thoroughly integrated into Royal Navy doctrine that their revolutionary nature was forgotten. General chase tactics that Anson used controversially became standard procedure, meaning later generations couldn't appreciate how radical they'd been. His emphasis on gunnery training, ship maintenance, and systematic preparation seemed obvious by the 19th century, making it hard to credit him for insights that later officers considered common sense. Success made his innovations invisible. They worked so well they became tradition, losing attribution in the process. Historical writing compounded the problem. Napoleonic Wars generated enormous documentation, memoirs, and scholarly analysis that kept those conflicts vivid in public consciousness. Earlier 18th century naval actions were covered less extensively, with fewer personal narratives and less dramatic framing. Anson himself was famously reticent, leaving no memoir and few personal papers that could have been mined for the human interest stories that create compelling historical narratives. Modern naval historians recognize Anson's importance, ranking him among the greatest British admirals for both combat success and institutional reform. Academic studies detail how his administrative work enabled later victories, how his tactical doctrines influenced generations of officers, and how his zero-loss record remains unmatched. But academic recognition doesn't translate to popular memory, which prefers dramatic narratives over systematic competence and heroic deaths over successful careers. The injustice is that George Anson achieved everything a naval officer could aspire to: combat victories, strategic success, institutional reform, and lasting legacy in doctrine and ships that dominated for generations. He was competent, successful, and transformative. He simply wasn't romantic, didn't die dramatically, and had the misfortune of preceding an admiral whose story was irresistibly tragic. If you found this forgotten story compelling, share it in the comments. Who else deserves recognition history has denied? Hit that like button if you believe competence deserves remembrance as much as tragedy. And subscribe, because history is filled with extraordinary people whose achievements shaped our world, but whose names we've forgotten, and they deserve better than oblivion.